You know, it's been pretty great over the last couple of years developing something of an audience. A following and YouTube subscribers and fans and people on Twitter who want to know what I have to say about stuff. But to be honest, it's getting kind of annoying. I am kind of sick of having them. So I thought the best way to get rid of them would be to start a new YouTube video series exploring the theory and philosophy and politics of various aspects of film that I feel aren't explored enough. That should do the trick, and along the way I might remind people of some of my more contrarian opinions, like the fact I think the Star Wars prequels are actually pretty good. Stuff like that. I just did it then, didn't I? Welcome to SCANLINE. If you're older than the age of 20 or have parents that don't throw things out, then you probably have at least a couple of these things in an attic or a shed somewhere. These are video home system cassette tapes, commonly known as tapes. They entered use in the late 1970s and were a very popular way of watching films and shows in your own home anytime you wanted, which for the time was a really novel and new concept. With Selectivision, you can go to the movies at your house. I know this because I looked it up on the Wikipedia page when I was writing this script. But let's get into what the world's largest encyclopedia doesn't want you to know. If you weren't in front of it when a show aired or hadn't gone into the cinema when a film was out, your primary interaction with most pieces of modern entertainment and culture would have been through the medium of us. Almost every piece of audiovisual art you consumed, no matter what it was made with, shot on, or how advanced the budget and special effects, you saw it via the signal produced from the magnetic reels in these plastic boxes. If you fell in love with a story, it was probably thanks to these tapes. It's a pity, then, that they look like shit. A standard Polaroid recording consisted of roughly 320 horizontal lines and 576 vertical lines of visual information. Worse, you wouldn't actually be getting your films at that resolution. Since most films were produced in wide or super wide screen, but was for the 4:3 resolution of contemporary televisions, you had a problem even showing a film. You could crop out the sides of a film and move the screen around, what's called pan and scan, which could totally ruin the story of films where multiple things were happening on different sides of the frame, or you could scale the whole thing down and add black bars to the top and bottom, creating what was called the letterbox effect. On the pan and scan version of A New Hope, the opening text crawl doesn't to fit the screen, so you have to wait until it gets here before you can even possibly read it. In the widescreen version, you can see the entire line of text as soon as it enters the frame, but it's scaled down so it's just as hard to read. I always really liked the scene from Aliens where Burke is trying to be friendly with Ripley in hospital, so he brings Jonesy in and sits backwards in his chair and spins playfully in it while the camera pulls in and gets more intimate, so he can then tell her that she's been frozen for 57 years. There's lots of good moments of subtle acting and characterization, and I like the cinematography of this cool sci-fi room, and there's a cute cat in the frame, too. The pan and scan version of this scene just barely manages to get both characters in the frame at once. It completely removes a lot of Burke's body language as he tries to be nice while preparing to break the news to her, and poor Jonesy's head is cut off. Jonesy isn't in this film after the beginning. Does Jonesy over here look happy with pan and scan? I don't think he does, but I can't actually tell. Even worse, because of the vile machinations of capitalism, the first preferred solution by movie studios was pan and scan, so they sold all the films like that, and then, once they figured out that directors hated having their films recut to fit the new frame and widescreen was basically objectively superior because it displayed the entire film, They got to sell you the films all over again with the promise that this time it was better. Now, for the first time on video, you can savor the true experience of these blockbusters in their original format. Widescreen. My copy of The Aliens Special Edition, The Aliens Special Edition. Apparently I bought this tape from Oxydomorph. Opens with a commercial for the widescreen versions of Alien and Die Hard. Fuckers. And guess what? This version of Aliens is in pan and scan. This is already the special edition of Aliens, and now you retelling me I gonna have to buy it again when the widescreen special edition comes out. 20th Century Fox. More like 22nd Century Wayland Uteni. I am sorry. And that was it. That was how people watched films. They picked their poison between a tiny version of the original film or a recut, reframed, gutted, despicable, cat-erasing version of the original, and whichever one you picked, you got it in this flickery format. You got this facsimile of the film that you wanted to see, and that was how we consumed media. For decades. Some versions of the above-average fantasy film series Star Wars only ever widely existed on this format. Many fans of Star Wars all over message boards and forums and my mentions fell in love with the films because of tapes they rented or bought. Because of this. But wait a minute. We can talk about specs and make fun of the video quality all day. People still watched them, people still used them to record shows off things, and people still shared and circulated those recordings. Thanks to people wanting to see things and needing tape to do so, homemade tapes are still the only way to find copies of shows that weren't available in any official format. Many episodes of Mystery Science Theater did to get a proper release for years after their initial air date, and many still don't. Prior to high-speed internet, the only way of accessing these old episodes was through home recordings people happened to have made at the time the show aired. You'd be amazed at what hoops folks would jump through to see a show they liked, even on a low-res home tape recording. And what if you were a fan of anime in the era prior to major home video releases of foreign animation? Why, you would have to hope you knew a store with crazy import stuff with really poor fan translations, or hope someone had taped the shows that did make it over at the crazy times they turned up. In retrospect, the format wasn't great, but it was certainly good enough for audiences who wanted to watch something in the comfort of their own homes whenever they wanted to, and it was basically the first format that allowed people to do this. It led to widespread consumption of material that would otherwise be forgotten or go unseen. In the 70s and 80s, for the first time ever, a regular person could have an archive of shows or films they enjoyed without having to get a projector and go in search of film reels on eBay, which would be really hard to do, considering that eBay did exist until 1995. Which was for the A person could learn about and consume elements of their culture and develop an understanding of film so much more easily than the decades prior. In fact, Quentin Tarantino and Kevin Smith worked in local video stores before becoming directors, giving them an opportunity to further incubate their own passion for film as well as share it directly with others before going on to make some of the most influential films, for better or worse, of the 1990s. The advent of us ushered in a new era of accessibility for film fans. Tastes in film and appetites for film could be developed much more rapidly than ever before. It marked the beginning in a radical and permanent shift in media consumption. You were no longer reliant on what was playing in your local multiplex or what old French films the weird art schools were projecting that month, and you no longer had to adhere rigidly to schedules or catch films or opt for shows deemed worthy of being shown. The shift was so radical that film companies panicked. Then Père head Jack Valenti, in an act of comical hyperbole, said in a congressional hearing that the Cure is to the American film producer and the American public as the Boston Strangler is to the woman home alone. Universal Studios even sued Sony on the grounds of copyright infringement over their Betamax video recording format. Over those audio Luckily, it was ruled that home recording devices operate under fair use, and of course, once film companies realized how profitable home video could be, they backed off. Many films started being made with their sales on the burgeoning and seemingly never-endingly hungry market in mind, or even without the intent of ever being screened in a theater. Some were barely even films. They were instructional videos or Christmas-themed cat nightmares or musical propaganda for a Christian cult that lived in the woods. Lots of popular films did well on tape, but still others did hugely well on tape, more so than you could expect from their cinematic release or critical reception. The question here is why? What is it about being available on VHS that made people suddenly become connoisseurs of horror or independent film? Wives, and Well, those reasons tend to get overlooked. Let's look at some of them right now. Music begins to fade out when making the film Jaws, which would come to be regarded as the first ever summer blockbuster. Spielberg and company discovered some problems with the shark prop. The animatronics kept breaking down, bits kept falling off of it, and most importantly, it kept sinking. The fake shark had trouble floating in water. Spielberg instead had to rely on using shots of almost everything but the shark to demonstrate the horror of its presence, show the aftermath, show explosions of blood in the distance, show the actors' reactions. The result was a film where you barely ever get to see the animatronic shark, but its presence is felt regardless. The shark is rendered even scarier by not being shown in all its glory, and its glory wasn't really all that much to see anyway. It was a broken mechanical shark. Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an incredibly startling and foundational film in the horror genre. When James Foreman, a British censor and secretary of the at the time, tried to cut the film to reduce its violent and nightmarishly oppressive atmosphere, he found, to his own personal shock, that he couldn't. There isn't all that much actual violence or blood in the film. There are no single pieces or shots you could remove to diminish its effects. Instead, it's a cumulative effect of all the properties of the entire film in setting a tone and creating a mood without needing to show you anything in particular. In the end, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was refused a certification by the Vcodec, effectively banning it in the United Kingdom. What these stories tell you is that even in visual mediums, supposedly all about showing people things for achieving some effects, often less is more. The human mind is incredibly good at scaring itself, and sometimes not being shown what you supposed to be scared of is the worst thing. Confusion settles in, fear of what could be there, what could happen fills your head, and your imagination, with its own particular fears, gets to substitute those over whatever's actually there. Texas Chainsaw Massacre did fantastically well when it was released in 1981, allowing many Brits access to the film for the first time, but many horror films did well on tape, even if they relied much more on gore or were poorly cut, and this is because of a particular form of this principle. Let's think about us again. That awful tiny resolution, flickery screen, even pure blackness is off kilter. If you walked into a room with this playing, you might even think you re-watching a scene of something hiding in darkness. I bet you can almost make out a figure hidden there in all the noise. You see where I'm going with this now, don't you? Here's Salien, one of the best. most emotionally intense and scary films ever on VHS, and through these tapes, Alien was flipping terrifying. I remember being out of my mind scared by this low-res monstrosity, and it was just because of the great acting, directing, editing, creature design, or music. It was because in all the tensest and darkest moments you could never really quite be sure what you were looking at. Abstract shapes in the background could almost look like something else. The flickers and noise in the darkness were easily confused for glimpses of the monster. Even when you were sure nothing was there, you could never really be sure. When the monster actually turned up, it was almost a relief. Like, at least now, you knew where the creature actually was. You never let it go. You never let it go, Dallas. In other words, a lower resolution format can increase the emotional impact of a scene. Horror and suspense have the chance to strike people like it never had before. No wonder films like this did well. In some ways, modern high-resolution versions of these films can't quite capture that particular magic. Here's a scene from the Blu-ray version. It looks great, but it's not as scary because you can quite definitely see that nothing's there. You know the character is alone in ways that you couldn't be certain of before. Really good films actually put this principle into practice within the medium itself. For example, Alien and Aliens both have sequences that prominently feature the use of cameras and video feeds with a very poor signal. Even if the higher resolution version of the film does diminish some of the horror elements, these segments still hold up exactly like they always did because the effects of viewing low-resolution video are worked into the aesthetic of the film. As a kid, David Cronenberg rotated his antenna to pick up signals he was supposed to access late at night when there was supposed to be anything on the air. Well, what if the images that you pulled up were really quite extreme, disturbing, possibly illegal? And what would you think then? Would you keep seeking out those channels, or would you call the police, or what would you do? How would you respond to that? The fear and excitement he felt in anticipation of what he might see, that fear of what was out there hidden in the static, inspired him to make Videodrome, so at least one great horror film was conceived entirely because of this effect. Horror and slasher films did really well on tape for this reason, and many films became long-running series that probably wouldn't ever have done so without such successful post-cinema releases on a format that arguably made them scarier. Even boring or flat shots in mediocre films can be made more tense by telling the audience a killer is out to get the protagonists and making it just a little bit tougher to see where they could be hiding. This also solves another problem. Those of you who watched me in retrospect, woefully unfocused and unresearched video from 2016 about what makes action films work will remember I made a comment about how the KI in Terminator 2 used to look better. Well, here we are. Thank you, Shannon, for helping me edit this video and stop it taking another year. Computer graphics and animation were largely lacking in the 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s. Nothing really quite looked right. Things didn't feel like they were really there. Texture and displacement mapping wasn't up to snuff, and you had smooth-looking weird stuff in your frame. It was too great. But even mediocrity can blend right in on tape. This checkerboard man rising out of the floor to murder a guy made me scared of my kitchen floor going to the fridge at night as a hyperactive child. It was vivid, like in my mind's eye. Robert Patrick was gonna come out at any moment and cut me entire body off. Seeing the now easily available high-definition version of this scene made me feel like an idiot. My mind had done most of the work with the bad fidelity. I think people who saw this scene in a theater kind of had the scariest bits of the film ruined for them because in the film prints shown in theaters, this would have stuck out just as much. But it wasn't just the relative badness of the image that popularized certain things over others in the medium of the video home system. Another important facet was the fact that, well, it was in your home. Like I said before, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was effectively not allowed into cinemas when it was first released in the book. While some local councils allowed it to be shown in their theaters, the viewing experience would have been quite weird. You'd be openly going out and paying to sit and see something you knew was banned in other areas for being violent and horrific. It was like you were committing a crime or were openly telling people you wanted to see that stuff since you'd actively gone and sorted out. But the uncensored 1981 video release did amazingly, and it's quite clear why. Instead of going out and sitting in a public space for 90 minutes and then awkwardly shuffling out trying not to make eye contact with the other people who'd come to see this widely banned film, you saw it with an audience of your choosing in the privacy of your own home at a time that suited you. There was a sense of being free of judgment. The eyes of the outside world were no longer a factor in your viewing experience. This encouraged people to seek out films they'd never go to see in public, which of course includes pornography. It's really not hard to see why home video almost immediately killed porn theaters. Kevin Smith has happily recounted his time renting porn to customers, saying, and that having a frank conversation with someone about their sex life informed his work a great deal. Home viewing also allowed for a less adult form of privacy, a kind of comfortable intimacy with friends or family that you can't get in a theater. Getting together on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and the glow of a television to watch a scary movie is an oft-repeated familial ritual in much the same way that gathering around a campfire bathed in orange light to tell ghost stories has been for generations. There are also other factors. You might have noticed that prior to the 90s, television was shot very straightforwardly and blankly with actors even in close-ups framed very differently from films shot at the same time. This is because televisual language has to serve a different purpose from film language. Movies are urgent, projected way up and away from you, staring down at you and occupying your entire view. You are consumed by a film and encouraged to think about it and its composition. You don't do anything else in a cinema but watch the film. A television is a smaller screen, often a good distance from you, even in a kitchen where other noises and events are distracting you. You might even be reading a book or talking to someone else while the TV is playing. The early production style knew that you weren't always going to be paying attention, only pulling you in for the more dramatic or important moments of a given episode, usually using something like having music start to play. The smaller screen also changes the way we relate to the image and the people in it. Television can be more human, friendlier. Those little people on the screen are having a nice chat about current events, and I feel somewhat included or informed. A talk show blown up to 70 feet, staring down at you in a darkened room with surround sound blasting in your ears would be overpowering to say the least. And it turns out the aesthetic and design of some films are predisposed to mesh beautifully with the qualities of the television. Nothing exemplifies this in practice quite like Mallrats. Mallrats was Kevin Smith's second film, produced after the success of his first picture, the small, self-funded indie hit Clerks. When Mallrats came out, no one really got it. People who loved the low-budget, avant-garde, doing-it-ourselves, grainy aesthetic of Clerks hated the well-produced, overly slick feel. People who cared about editing or cinematography or good-looking shots got a kind of flat-looking film with a bunch of boring wide shots of multiple people just sort of talking about stuff. Serious critics, into the pointed, pop-culturally slanted insights of clerks and the honest thoughts of astray Gen Xers, were treated to a bunch of wacky characters farting about in a mall, tricking people they didn't like into making their hands smell like shit. The film did terribly critically and at the box office. It looked like Kevin Smith, the indie darling behind Clerks, had basically torched his career with only his second film. Luckily, a film would then come out which would miraculously untorch his career. That film was called Mallrats on Tape. In 2001, on the subject of criticism of his films, Smith said, "We should be able to make any movie we want, stupid or not, so long as it doesn't we should cost too much and is reasonably guaranteed to make its money back for our distributor. That, for the curious, is why we allowed to keep making movies. Some cats, oh, I hate how he talks. Some cats, particularly the denizens of internet movie chat boards, can't figure out why we allowed to continue lensing flicks when we never seem to grow as visual storytellers or keep making, what's to them, the same movie. The answer is that we've never lost anybody money. I'll say that again. We've never lost anybody money. Granted, we came close with Rats, but even that made a killing on video and more recently did. Despite box office troubles, the same film no one went to see and critics snubbed was suddenly doing gangbusters, making it an even more interesting sort of cult hit than its predecessor. And it's because of the aesthetic differences of playing a film on it. All of a sudden, the shot composition isn't as important because it's kind of far away from you and you redoing something else in the room while it plays, and the low quality of the format means that even if the shots were particularly good, you wouldn't really have noticed anyway. You aren't having the aimless banter about nothing blasted at you from speakers all around you like it's the most important thing in the world and you have to listen to every second. It's playing nearby and you just kind of listening in on these people talking free associatively about their film opinions. With this change in the viewing experience, all of a sudden more Rats makes sense. It becomes a funny little film where the big scenes and funnier jokes grab your attention and the stuff that falls flat or is so well directed doesn't matter so much because it's easier to ignore. Here's an IMDb review from 2003. Brad Kminis from Auckland, New Zealand jokingly says the film is best watched with your eyes closed. They criticize the look and feel of the film and the hamminess of the overall plot, but they loved the dialogue, and they found it sharp and effervescent, and they say it's their favorite film of Kevin Smith's. I would say so far, but honestly, considering the films he made after 2003, More Rats is probably still their favorite. Kevin Smith films screened in a theater on a big screen are arguably missing the point. The joy of these films is in crowding around a small pit at your friend's house and watching little people on it with no pretensions of grandiosity being shitty to customers and talking about their lives. If you've sat down and watched More Rats screened in a high resolution and a cool retro revival screening at your local college, unsubscribe from me channel immediately, Kurt. We talked about this. I don't want to be your friend anymore. Imagine all the films from across history that were doomed to be misunderstood by the theater-going audience whose real destiny was to be truly appreciated on the small screen where the viewer's relationship with the work was completely different. This was the first second chance for those films, and it created an appreciation for these kinds of story for televisual filmmaking. You can see this trend happening in reverse as televisions get bigger and their picture becomes clearer and their aspect ratio more film-like. To shows with a cinematic approach like Breaking Bad, Mad Men, The Sopranos, or Hannibal Air becoming more prominent and popular. Abo calls itself home box office because the home viewing experience is finally akin enough to a theater that these aesthetic changes can really be appreciated. People did just not care about having television that wasn't a very nice looking for 60 years. Our relationship with the screen simply changed in accordance with its change in format and size in our living rooms. In the age of demand, soap operas are waning in popularity as the increased fidelity and the typical viewer's filmic awareness expose the show production failings and straightforwardness more than the older ways could, and the idea that you could be watching Game of Thrones or House of Cards at any time suddenly makes Neighbors a bit less of a thing that you all the the video of IOV IO 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 still to so IO 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 where Oh, view, 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 view. Oh, view, view, view. Oh, view, view, view. Oh, view. Oh, view, 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 way, view, 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 view. Oh, view, 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 view. They make it in Australia, but they make it for us because we're the only people who watch it. Why are we? I'm a little bit worried this might once again make it harder for some films to be appreciated because you even watch them like a film at home. But it's not like we gonna just stop making television shows, so we probably fine for now. People will always want higher fidelity versions of their favorite films. Some people want a high-res version of the original cuts of Star Wars so badly that they've resorted to making that version themselves with different restorations pulling from 35mm prints, 17 prints, optical broadcast, these special features, and more, all in the service of recreating the films they remember from way back when. You can also see this battle happening on the filmmaking end. A filmmaker will always find newer and better cameras on the market, more bit depth, better codecs, 1080p, fork, ATK sensors, all for footage that will often end up getting seen on YouTube at whatever resolution their audience they could see. Computer monitors or phone screens happen to be with YouTube. And looking good doesn't necessarily mean having the best definition. Telling a good story is the goal, and if you get that wrong, not even doing it on an Arri Alexa can save you. Obviously, shoot on the best equipment you can get your hands on and aim for a form of distribution that best suits your work. But I think the real challenge is to make something that people would fall in love with even if they were watching it on a crappy old tape in the 90s and in its own way, whether we like it or not. Those tapes and the impact they had will never leave you. Heavy, hail. They will. Yeah. well, they do, they oh, they oh, they do, they oh, they oh, they oh, Veo, oh, veo, boy, veo, I will, where, veo, veo, I zero, zero, veo, The format is in our history now, and we remember it. Nostalgia is real, and it affects how we view old films or perceive new films that use it as a purposeful style. Many films made in the vein of 80s or 90s horror get limited little VHS releases because that's the style they were courting in the first place. Then there are the immensely popular retro camcorder phone apps you can get and the webbaskets that use the aesthetic as part of a deeper throwback to kitschy 90s children's programming. Many new films exist only in the form of tapes or what are designed to look like low-res rips of tapes like the truly fascinating, funny, and smart enough Halloween special in order to channel the style and further create a sense of seeing a documented record of a time period. One film that combines all of this with tapes, ability to make cheap special effects look better is the found footage film Loves, an anthology of a bunch of short films from various Vcodec videotapes, and its relative low-budget effects are done real justice by the aesthetic. The final segment, 10 minutes 30 minutes 98, has a truly fascinating climactic sequence where everything goes completely crazy nuts, and it's the most frighteningly real a horror segment with what are actually fairly rudimentary effects has ever felt, because the poor quality of the footage makes it so much more believable. If you filmed a window actually sliding out of existence and hands coming out of the walls on a camera from this time period, it would literally look exactly the same as this footage. And knowing that makes this sequence infinitely punchier and more real feeling than the same effect would in any modern horror film. Growing up, I think the first favorite film I ever had was Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits. I think it was the first film I ever saw where seeing it felt like it was made for me. It took me sense of alienation from adult life and channeled it into telling a story about a vividly imaginative world where the outsiders were the ones who were truly free, escaping from their parents' invading armies, and even the will of God in getting what they wanted out of life. It made me feel good to not be like everyone else, like I was getting one over on the world somehow. This film helped make me who I am and shape how we see everything, and it did it on my dad's cine television in letterbox widescreen. Obviously, for the sake of preservation and film history, a high-res official version of Hand Shooting First would be nice to have. We can chase higher and higher resolutions as much as we want, and we should. I think they look great. But the funny and kind of amazing thing is millions of people only needed a fifth of those lines of resolution on a tiny screen to fall in love with these films and have them shape how they see the world. For me, Time Bandits is the objectively crappy version I saw as a kid over and over on a tiny widescreen tape in the night when no one else was around, feeling inspired by the sense of adventure and briefly pausing to go to the kitchen for a snack and get scared by the floor. All thecks in the world want to replicate the experience they had as a kid. It might even ruin it by revealing all the obvious models and matte paintings and all the wood screws on the sets for what they really were. This was always a kind of bad format. But in spite, and because of all its problems, it caused a dramatic shift in pop culture and in the taste and approaches to cinema by viewing audiences which is still felt to this very day in the form of the cinema literacy and particular feel and tasting it cultivated even by accident with its style. Oh no, look what happened by accident. Look what happened Oh no, look what happened by accident. Oh no, look what happened by accident.